I wasn't going to talk much for the next few days. However, recent news developments have inspired me or pissed me off enough, I don't know which it is, to make a comment. Right now, I want to talk about what's going on and what happened in Minneapolis, Minnesota. There was a video that I watched yesterday about some policemen trying to arrest a black man for allegedly trying to pass a counterfeit $20 bill. There were three policemen with their knees on the black man, one on the back of the calves, one in the back of the back, and a third one in sort of a sleeper or chokehold with his knee on the guy's throat. Now, the crowd was gathered around and they were shouting. And the shouting was real informative and interesting. They were saying, things like, let him go, you're hurting him. He was crying, I can't breathe, I can't breathe. So finally, when he stopped moving entirely, the policeman drug him over and turned him on his back to handcuff him. No, excuse me, he was handcuffed. And the crowd, some people in the crowd were saying, take his pulse, take his pulse, take his pulse. And they didn't. They waited apparently for the ambulance. And he was dead. So here a person was killed right in front of an audience. A black man with white cops in front of a mixed audience. Well, then the authorities were interviewed and gave speeches. The mayor of Minneapolis was outraged. However, the police commissioner and the county attorney, which is probably the equivalent of a district attorney, said they wouldn't make an arrest or wouldn't do anything because there wasn't enough evidence. Newly discovered evidence showed that he might not be guilty of a crime. Well, there are 3 or 4 videos, all of them pretty much show that it was murder, or at least manslaughter, and that even though it may not have been premeditated, they had plenty of opportunities to get up, to do whatever they could without suffocating him or killing him. He was subdued, he was handcuffed. There were 4 officers against him. And it was in a crowd, so I don't know what the hell they expected, what they were afraid of, but it seems to me the police are always claiming that they're following orders or they feared for their lives or other lame excuses like that. The unfortunate thing is the way our judiciary and our judicial system is structured anymore. They can get away with it. I remember when I first started practicing law, judges came from the community. They were trustees in banks, real estate lawyers, defense attorneys, prosecutors, city attorneys, corporate attorneys from all over. And after a certain amount of practice, they applied for judgeships, and some of them were appointed. Some of them were political appointees. For instance, after I ran for district attorney, I was asked to apply for a judgeship, and the judicial committee said I was overqualified, but that was maybe just to make me feel good. I'm not real sure. Anyway, what I saw yesterday was just really disturbing, and I thought it was inexcusable. And I've been harping on this for several years now. The police have been out there murdering people, and what they're claiming is they were following their training or they were fearful of their lives, and they're using this as an excuse. And that's just utter bullshit. It's the Nuremberg defense, as I call it. It's the same thing the Germans used. They were just following orders. They were doing what they were trained to do. The judges in Nazi Germany signed these deportation orders because they were following the law accordingly. And it's inexcusable. So you've got to look at the way things are structured and the way they've changed. And a lot of this happened after Nixon. But one of the big problems with the judiciary right now is the fault of the American people. There was this big program and this big movement to change the tax structure and to save taxpayers' dollars. Well, one of the biggest tax expenditures in state government is pension plans. And you get a retirement after so many years of government service. Well, generally, the stepping stone to be a judge now is X number of years in the public defender's office or X number of years in the prosecutor's office. In other words, you start out as a government lawyer, you never go into private practice. And after so many years as a government lawyer, all of a sudden you're a government judge. And you look at things as the way a bureaucrat does and view your job as that of an assembly line. I don't see any difference between the way cases are handled in courts nowadays than the way automobiles are made in a General Motors or Ford plant. It's an assembly line, and decisions are made in such a way that you keep the cases going. That's why 97% of the cases plead guilty. You don't have trials anymore, and they rig the rules so that if you ask for a trial, you're punished. And the judges are, I wouldn't say intellectually incapable, I just think they're lazy as hell, and they don't want to make bad decisions, and they're indoctrinated. If you're in the governmental system and after a court or on breaks or whatever, you hang out with other government officials. And if you're a prosecutor, your friendship group, your circle of friends is that of police and law enforcement people. And I noticed, when I was a judge, I'd have coffee occasionally after court with the police, and they were always complaining about their problems and how the courts generally didn't understand them and that they'd slap people on the wrists and let them go, and the typical bitching that most of the police officers and the police establishment do. Well, I would take the time to say, well, it's not a slap on the wrist. Ever since the Magna Carta, people have had the right to bond. It's not catch and release. They post their bonds until their court appearance comes up. We don't have preventive detention here. We're not like fascist Italy, Nazi Germany, or Russia. We don't have a Napoleonic Code law. We have a common law. And they still take it personally as though allowing a bond is a slap in their face and an affront to their law enforcement abilities. Now, I was young then when I was a judge and didn't realize the magnitude of this until I ran into some of the fabrications that police did. And then I focused on the judges. And why do they let them get away with it when they know better? It's because it's expediency, and fairness, and justice are sacrificed for the sake of expediency. And the reason that you've got the expediency is the perception of public officials is that the public's too damn cheap to really fund things the way they should be, and therefore we got to be cheap and we got to be efficient, because efficiency is much more popular with the voting public than is justice or fairness. And of course, the most efficient way of production is the assembly line. That's why we have assembly line justice. And you have this indoctrination, and you can explain it in postmodern theory terms, but I don't want to bore you with all that shit. But essentially, you pick up the ideas and the construction of what is or isn't, or the construction of reality, as sociologists call it, and the reality of the people growing up with cops and other civil servants like that is a point of view of the civil servants. So if you're not from the community but stay inside the government structure, law enforcement structure, you're not exposed to any other ideas, any other points of view or whatever, and then you start mimicking the police line as they don't appreciate us, they don't understand our problems, we risk our lives eating the donuts and things like that. Well, you risk our lives making arrests. and patrolling and being out there with the public, neglecting the fact that more teachers every year are injured than policemen, or that, like where I grew up, farmers, people working around farm implements, it's much more hazardous, much more dangerous. They're much more prone to injury than a police officer. The difference is the average worker doesn't have the propaganda machine that the police do. And the press in the last several years has got lazy. They don't want to do any reporting. They just want to rewrite the police department's public relations statements explaining the case. And everybody's happy. The revenues can roll in, and then reporters don't have to do much work, and they can produce more column inches with less effort, and therefore the publications can make more money. The judges can collect fines, etc., and they make more money, and it looks like we're doing something, and we're just making arrests, processing cases, and not really doing justice. Well, that's okay if you're rich. It's okay if you live in a gated community or in a suburban area where there's not much crime, and you see the crime on the television and figure, oh, that's just really awful. What's wrong with these people, etc. And you cheer the cops on. And the judges think that's the way things are. Rarely do they venture beyond their country clubs or their Elks clubs or whatever. You'll rarely ever see them in a working class area or in a minority area or anything like that. So they have no idea what those people are thinking, nor do they really care. They don't have to care. They can remain ignorant, and everybody around them is ignorant because they're not exposed to various views and various cultures, and it's one happy circle jerk. I can remember there's a judge in Golden, Judge Nieto was his name, and I had some clients that were charged with possession of marijuana, and the male client wore a motorcycle jacket. He didn't belong to a club, but he was known among the Jefferson County authorities as sort of a biker. He looked like a biker, acted like a biker. And so he's in his apartment one day, and the police come to the place. And since it was a marijuana raid, we have all kinds of show with the television cameras and everything to make it show how efficient the police are and how tough on crime they are. And it's real easy to be a bully when you're arresting somebody for dope. Anyway, what they did is they threw a flashbang grenade into the room, and it landed 3 foot away from their 9-month-old baby. And then the arrest occurred. There was chaos. They kick in the door, and they find about 4 lids of marijuana, and they arrest the guy. And we're having a bond hearing, and the judge there is lecturing him how bad marijuana is, and it's the first step to heroin. The Anslinger bullshit that the propagandists want everybody to believe. And I said something to the judge. He seemed like a fairly nice guy. And I said, Your Honor, the police threw a flashbang grenade injuring a 9-year-old baby, a 9-month-old baby. And he looks at me in self-righteous indignation and said, well, Mr. Blewett, they should have thought of this when they had marijuana in the house. How can you go against something like that when you got such bigotry and stubbornness and deliberate ignorance, and can self-righteously justify a very dangerous conduct by police officers on the basis that they were enforcing the law? It's just beyond my comprehension, and I've been at this 50 years. So anyway, that's my complaint and thoughts for the day. The interesting thing about the situation in Minneapolis was that the next day, when they didn't arrest the policeman, and the county attorney made up his manufactured bullshit thing, like he hadn't finished his investigation and there might be something that puts a different light on it. I can think in 50 years of practice, never once has a prosecutor said, well, we'd like to hold off arresting your client, Mr. Blewett, because we want to do a thorough investigation. You know, hell, they're chomping at the bit to make a bust and get on television or get publicity and show how tough they are and how insensitive they are and how mean they are. And, you know, don't give a criminal an even break. And this has really changed a lot in the last few decades. I can remember representing mafia figures when the FBI or the U.S. Marshals would call me and say, hey, are you representing Mr. Ciccarelli, Mr. Paulino, Mr. Bolano, etc.? And I'd say yes or no, generally yes. And they say, well, we have a warrant for him. When can you bring him in to be processed? And I'd ask them what the bond was. They'd tell me. The next day I'd show up with my client. We'd post bond and walk out of the courthouse. There wasn't this cowboy crap and things like that. And that started changing mainly under Reagan. I remember one time they went in to bust a school teacher for not reporting a child abuse like the statute said. They had a whole bunch of policemen. They handcuffed him and they made him do the perp walk, as they call it, walking handcuffed in front of all of his students throughout the school or through the school and into the parking lot and stick him in a police car to arrest him. They didn't really care about saving the public or anything else. They wanted to make a big show and show the other state workers that were inferior to them, that happened to have an education that they didn't, that they were the bosses and they didn't give a damn what educational theory said or psychological theory or sociological theory. They had the law behind them and they could go bust any smart-ass teacher that they wanted to and make an example out of him over the press. And of course, that's what they would do. Now you see them with their SWAT teams and things like that. You know, it's ironic you never see them arrest gangsters really with the fanfare that they do dope smokers. Anyway, I want all of you to think about this, and I hope I get some criticism and angry responses. And you can call me any name you want, but I want you thinking about this. And that's all for today. Have fun and have a good weekend. Dennis Blewett signing off.